Hello, loyal listeners. What's going on? This is Pete coming at you with episode number, 20 something of the Carrot Poker podcast. It's time to get back to the overview of the Grinder's Manual. Well, update first of all on the progress with my book. It is, for any of you who don't know, I'm writing a poker book that serves to be like a kind of textbook if you like to, comprehensive textbook to No Limit Hold'em, Cash Game, Six Max online. And I'm finished writing, so that's pretty cool. I'm into the editing phase now, which is probably a bigger project than I first anticipated, but I'm really hoping that by the end of the month, I'm going to be pretty much ready to get this thing out. I know it's really irritating, and I said October originally, then I said December, then I said January, and it's probably going to be early February, but it's the way it goes with a project like this. It's the first time I've ever written a book, so yeah, kind of hard. I'm a one-man machine, and it's kind of hard to know exactly how long everything's going to take me and how much life is going to interfere and get in the way. As it did a couple of months ago. So, I mean, yeah, we're getting there, and I figure we should plow on with our overview and give you guys a continued flavour of what to expect in this book when it comes out. You will be able to purchase it, by the way, on Amazon as an ebook, Kindle format. It's the most secure way to do it, really, so I figured that would be the way to publicise the book. Okay, so last time we took a slight deviation. We did ask the coach, and we're going to get back to more of that very soon. I'm going to get more of my students on the show. I think it was a really cool episode where we got Steve on to ask me a bunch of questions and put me right on the spot. Made me think on my feet, much like you have to do when you play a poker session. Good skill for me to practice, I guess. And so, yeah, we'll loads more of that. If you enjoyed that episode, don't worry, there'll be more like that. But for now, it's back into Theoryland, and we're going to pick up where we left off last time in our overview of the Grinder's Manual. So we were talking about the difference between two types of situation, open action and end of action. Just to recap, end of action spots were ones in which we face a bet, and if we call, it will be the last action that will go down for the hand. There may be more streets to run out, but there won't be any more decision points for either player. An open action spot is different. That's where there are future actions to take in the hand, such as when you call an open pre-flop. Again, we're facing a bet, but we may be calling an open pre-flop, calling a flop bet, raising a turn bet, whatever we do, there'll be more decision points to come later in the hand, and that distorts things. Why? Because in open action spots, you have things to think about like implied odds, future fold equity, future textures and runouts, opponent tendencies on later streets, how realizable your showdown value is, all these kind of concepts that distort the EV of calling. However, the scope of today's episode is very much just end of action spots, and these are much simpler beasts to deal with as poker players and as analysts. In an end of action spot, like I said last time, we're often just looking at the bet size that our opponent makes. And I mean, there are a couple of ways we can think about it. If we actually have some idea what his range is, then we should be looking, or we can make some estimates about his range. We should be looking to make a decision in a vacuum most of the time, looking at required equity, RE as I call it, which is derived from basically the amount that you have to call divided by that amount again, plus the total pot after villain has bet into it. So if villain bets 6 on the river into 12, then you have to call 6 into a pot that is 18. So 18 plus 6 is 24. 6 divided by 24 is 25%. That's how much equity you have, or 3 to 1 if you like, are your pots. 6 into 18. So that's a little recap. Today we're going to talk about the next part of the process. It's not just that you need to know how much equity you need. The whole other skill is how much equity do I have? And my students always ask me, but Pete, like, how do we possibly calculate our equity? Do I get like PokerStove up and just put a range in? Like, of course not. You're in game. You need to do it roughly. And what I say to my students in these spots, I'm going to use the model of facing a river bet for the duration of this episode. When you face that river bet and you've found your required equity, so you've realized that you need to be good about 30% of the time, it's not going to be really possible to be like, okay, what is my equity percentage exactly? A better way to do it is to use that 30% milestone. We generated that for a reason. We generated that so we could compare how well we think we're doing roughly with that milestone. So instead of saying, what's my equity, and then saying my equity is probably X, like 63.2%, we're humans, we can't do that, unfortunately. So instead, too much unknown information, basically, even if we were supercomputers. But anyway, instead what we need to do here is actually say, right, do we meet our target? Do we think we meet our target, roughly? Are we likely to fall below it or above it? That's it. Simple question. If you meet your target, you can call. If you don't, you should fold. Pretty simple. I mean, I'm simplifying here. there are times you want to turn a hand into a bluff and stuff like that, and bluff face the river, but we're going to just ignore all of that for now, because that wouldn't be an end of action spot. In an end of action spot, we're deciding between calling and not calling. Calling and folding, basically. Okay, so how do we actually use this two-part thought process? Let's jump straight into a hand that I'm actually taking. This is hand 48 out of 153 from the Grinders Manual. There are a lot of hands in this manual, a lot of examples. It's a very practical, focused book. There is theory, there are figures, there are charts and tables and math all over the place, but there are also a lot of hands that took me an absolute eternity to create. In this nice kind of neat format that I've made them in. It took a while. I made all my own cards and I made the templates and all of this stuff. And yeah, then I just started churning out hand history after hand history. And actually, you know, at first it's kind of fun creating a hand history and being like, okay, so Hero has this. After like the 152nd one, you just never want to see another hand history again in your life, I can assure you. In this hand, Hero's on the button. And in the Grinders Manual, to give you guys a flavour, in a hand history, Hero will always be red, so it's very clear to see from the list of players who Hero is. The positions are listed first, with stack sizes that are, if they're not 100 BBs deep, stats on villain. The players involved in the hand are bolded, so you can see clearly who they are. Below that, we have a little bit of text saying dealt to Hero, then his 2 whole cards in 4 colour, and his cards here are 10-10. And in this hand, there's a reg in the hijack, who opens the 3 big blinds after Under the Gun folds. Hijack is middle position, Under the Gun +1 and 6 max. 25-20 are his stats, and his RFI, his raise first in from the hijack, is 19, so he has a somewhat loose hijack range. I'd say a 19% open range from the hijack is fairly on the loose side. So we basically are on the button and we decide to flat pre-flop. I think this is pretty standard. Against most regs, unless the guy is like a maniac who's 4-bet bluffing way too much. We don't really want a 3-bet jam 10s. We also don't really want a 3-bet fold 10s. It's a hand that has it's a hybrid hand that has a lot of good playability without flopping a set, but it's also a very strong implied odds hand as well, because it can flop a set in position and make a lot of money, and can even set over set other sets sometimes. Rarely, but sometimes. So 10s is a good hybrid call, as I will call it. I'll get to this part of the manual. I've actually jumped ahead here for some reason to a later chapter, but I think it's kind of interesting to do this bit now, and then I'll come back and do more pre-flop calling stuff when I talk about 3-betting later. Anyway, so I call this a hybrid call pre-flop. I think it's a standard call. So we go 2-way to the flop, as in the hijack opener, with 7.5 BBs in the pot. Our R3 has 3 and the 1.5 dead from the blinds. The flop is 9-3-2 rainbow, and so no backdoor draws for us or anything like that. And hijack bets 4.5 into 7.5 and Hero calls. So we've called the flop c-bet in position. The turn is the 5 of hearts, so it's now 9-3-2-5, completely rainbow, no flush draws out there. And the pot is 16.5 BBs on the turn. Hijack bets 12, and we call again with our pair of 10s. Fairly standard so far. I think like you can fold the turn against very tight players who obviously just have a lot of equity when they bet the turn and have a higher concentration of just overpairs. But I think that people will bluff a lot of ace-x on this turn in general, so I think the turn call is pretty much as standard as the flop call. Though there are arguments for folding the turns sometimes there against certain types of opponent. On the river, the pot is 40.5 BBs and small blind, hijack. There's a typo in my book that I need to correct. This is what I mean, I've not finished editing yet. It says hijack all the way through the hand, then it says small blind. Like, wow, I wonder how many of these there are going to be. The joys of editing. He bets 26 now into a pot of 40.5 and on the Queen of Hearts river. And it's up to Hero. So an overcard has come down on the river. Hero has pocket 10s. He's facing this bet of 26 into 40.5. Here's how not to think of this spot, right? I give, at this point, basically an example thought process that one of my less experienced students may have when he's trying to decide what to do, articulating to me, his coach, what he should do in this spot when I ask him. And here's the example of the bad thought process for this situation. Well, he's bet really big, so he might think that I think he's bluffing and trying to get me to call. Or is he trying to bluff me off my hand because he thinks I have something like I have? He would probably bet smaller with a value hand, actually, so I should call because he's trying to push me off the pot. This thought process to an amateur poker player, a new player, might sound legitimate, especially if villain ends up actually showing a bluff. we all play poker with like our friend who thinks he's great at poker, who actually knows nothing about the game technically, or the morons in the casino who play every day and are degenerate gamblers but think that they're great poker players, although they don't even study the game at all. I shouldn't call them morons, it's kind of nasty, but yeah, these people are very infuriating to sit around if you're a serious poker player. Anyway, so we all hear these thought processes, and if Velen actually does show up with a bluff in this situation, we might even kid ourselves into thinking, wow, that guy really knows what he's talking about. He said that Velen was bluffing here, and Velen was bluffing, so he must have had a great read. Well, no, Velen will be bluffing some percentage of the time. The person who has this, the student that has this thought process, or the guy in the casino who has this thought process, doesn't know that Velen's bluffing this one time, most of the time. Sometimes there may be some tell, or someone's range may be that transparent, but most of the time he doesn't. He's just having a random thought and deciding that that's the case, and when shown the bluff, he decides that he was 100% perfectly accurate with his thought and will always be right when he has that thought against that player in that situation, which is not true. This thought process is flawed because it assumes a lot of things. Well, it's erratic, first of all. He's bet really big, so he might think that I think he's bluffing. I mean, this is on the internet. Like, you don't know this guy. You don't know how he thinks. You've got no idea what he's doing. Like, stop trying to create, like, metagame and psychology where there is none. Like, Velen could have that thought. He could also just have all kinds of thoughts or no thoughts at all. He could just be autopiloting, playing his range in a set way. He could just be deluded and thinking that he has a value hand with a pair of fives. Like, we really don't know. There are a lot of things that could be going on here. Most of the time, however, we can make a good decision here about someone's range by looking at the population. Now, the question then, if you want to figure out how often Velen is bluffing, which, let's face it, that's what it comes down to for part 2 of our decision-making process here. First of all, though, let's clarify, we need to get our required equity, part A of the process, straight. So Velen's bet 26 into 40. For those of you watching on YouTube, you'll see a calculator on your screen right now, just doing this. If you're listening on iTunes, you won't, but that's fine, because I'm going to talk you through it. So Velen bets 26 into 40, making the total pot after Velen's bet 66 into 40.5, making the total pot after Velen bet 66.5. Amount to call for hero is 26, so we're basically dividing 26 into 26 plus 66.5, which is dividing 26 into 92.5, which will give us our required equity of 28%. 2/3 pot is generally 28%. This is about 2/3 pot. So, 28% required equity. Are we good 28% of the time? This depends how often Velen is bluffing. We don't know Velen. We just know his stats. How often is and that doesn't really differentiate him from many of the other regs in the pool. So what should we do? Well, just look at his player type, play against that. How often does the population bluff in these games? If this was like 50 NL, 100 NL online, I would say that the population bluffs a decent amount here these days, but probably not enough. Probably still underbluffs a lot, and there's some players who overbluff this spot. But overall, at the micro stakes, people definitely underbluff when they triple. It's predominantly a value range, particularly on a card that actually improves a lot of Velen's range. Like on this Queen River, Ace Queen gets there, King Queen, or whatever gets there. Velen was just barreling overcards with the gut shot with the Ace Queen. Certainly will be in his range a lot of the time. So, I mean, his range does improve here. Aces and Kings can still value bet. There are still enough value combos in Velen's range. I think that this spot's a fold, and that's basically me saying we need 28%. I don't think we have 28% on average. I think we're good less than a quarter of the time here or something on an average online game against an average player and in the kind of micro stakes. As you move up and you don't know how often someone bluffs, what you actually need to do in this spot is try and play your range instead. Like, I may not know how often Velen is bluffing me here, so what I'm going to do now is something very different. If I don't have a good population read to say that I should overfold my range on the river, that's to say fold more of my range than would be a balanced strategy, then I need to do something called defensive play and basically calling a set percentage of my range. So when I'm playing the river defensively, I'm not actually trying to make assumptions about Velen's range. I'm not saying he thinks I think this, because it's just nonsense. I don't know what he's doing. I've got no clue. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm a psychic soul reader. Instead, I'm going to say, how do I make Velen indifferent to bluffing me? How do I protect myself, regardless of whether Velen is bluffing a lot here or a little bit or not at all? How do I make it all the same? How do I make it indifferent? How do I ensure I'm not making a mistake? Or, more importantly, that I'm not opening up a hole in my game by having out-of-whack frequencies that Velen can then exploit later. I do this by basically making Velen realize his required fold equity on his bet and no more and no less. Now we switch it around and we look at things from Velen's point of view. He's betting the river 26 into 40.5. his bluff success rate is risk divided by risk plus reward. So it's 26 what he's risking divided by the 40.5 plus the 26 that he gets back. He gets that money back afterwards. So now, again, YouTube viewers will see the calculator back up on the screen, and we are basically dividing the 26 risk for villain into 66.5. And we see that his required fold equity here is about 40%, 39 to be precise. So if villain needs us to fold 39% of our range, we better fold exactly that much to make him indifferent. And that's to break even that he needs us to fold that amount, not to like start printing money. So let's make him indifferent. Let's just call. Let's fold 39% of our range, call 61% of our range. Is tens in the top 61% of the range we make it to the river to? With, it depends how wide we call the 5 of hearts turn. Again, the board is 9, 3, 2, 5, queen. How wide are we calling this turn? Do we have a lot of 9x here pre-flop? These are the kind of questions that are relevant. Do we have jacks and queens in our range? Do we 3-bet those pre-flop? Are those in our range? How do we play our sets? Do we slow play them on the flop and turn? Almost invariably yes, in this situation with a dry board in position for many reasons I won't go into right now, but I think our range here can contain all the sets. I think it can contain jacks, maybe queens. I don't think we have too much 9x, and it depends how wide we call turn, but I think tens may just creep into being a fold. It may be a bit too weak. There may even be hands like ace-queen that we call flop and turn with that now make top pair in the queen river. So I think tens is probably in the bottom 39% of our range here pretty comfortably, and I think that we can fold it from a balanced perspective, defensive point of view as well. But if we think the population just doesn't bluff here enough, then we should fold more than 39% of our range. Not everything, so we don't want to give villain like a green light to just like barrel us mercilessly in the future or show the population through our HUD stats that we're folding relentlessly. But we do want to start overfolding the river considerably if we have a read that the population is very tight there when it comes to tripling. So when you're the motto here, the lesson here in the end of action spot is that when you're clueless about villain or you don't have much of an idea, you're basically referring to population reads, or you're referring to just defensive play if you don't think the population is particularly unbalanced in the situation in question. So part A, required equity in the end of action spot. Part B, that's how you're thinking about it basically. Are you playing it defensively, or are you playing the river offensively, if you like, and trying to make a call that may not be a balanced strategy, that may be wider or tighter? There are a few questions you can ask yourself if you do know something about villain, or even if you don't, about board texture and things like that as well, that can help you decide part B of this. Do I meet required equity? Let me go through a few of the things that we can actually think about here that are going to help us significantly. Well, these are the kind of questions that are relevant. Here's the first one. Is it likely that villain can be value betting many worse hands? If villain can actually be value betting worse, your hand is more than just a mere bluff catcher, and it's definitely going to fit into a high percentile in your range. It's also going to be the case that your actual equity in practice when you call the river bet is going to be significantly more, because not only do you beat any bluffs that villain does have, but you beat a portion of his value range of some size depending on how strong your hand is relative to villain's value betting range on the river. So if you answer yes to question 1, is it likely that villain can be value betting many worse hands, then you're almost certainly going to be calling the river. I think it depends. I mean, normally it's a huge swaying factor in the direction of calling, basically, if you're not just beating bluffs. Question 2, and these questions, they can just basically help you save time. Sometimes you do have to revert to population reads or whatever, or to playing defensively, but if you can answer some of these in a definitive way, in a very sort of certain way that will, then you're basically going to be swaying your decision quickly towards either calling or folding. You don't have to play your range defensively. Question 2, does this villain get to the river with any air in his range? If he doesn't, and you've got a bluff catcher, because you've answered no to question 1, you can just make a quick fold. I mean, if in practice, like, the population just doesn't get to the river with air and isn't turning, like, made hands into bluffs very much, just fold. I mean, you don't have to really think about that too hard. You're gonna, if you need 33% to call the pot size bet and villain has no air and you have a bluff catcher, your equity is probably less than 5% or something. So, question 3, does villain credibly represent better hands? If he doesn't, if it's like really weird why he would use this sizing, or you just think that the population does not play a value hand this way very often, like populations at microstakes always bet flush draws on the flop. They don't have a balanced strategy that involves checking any flush draw combos usually. They see bet way too much as well. But anyway, so when the flush gets there on the river and they start going berserk having checked the flop, usually they're not going to have a flush. and they're polarizing their range, and it looks kind of full of shit, and you should probably call wider than normal. So if you answer that with no, does Vil incredibly represent better hand, strongly consider overcalling your range on the river, calling more of it than is balanced. Finally, question 4, what else do my population player type villain reads tell me? So this is when we've drawn a blank at the first 3 questions. Time to look at either player-specific reads, that's the best thing if we have those. If we don't have those, player type reads as an aggressive fish is going to be way more likely to be bluffing the river with an uncontrollable wide array of combos than a tight fish or a passive fish is going to be, or a reg. So you can bluff catch wider against him, especially when required equity is not too high. And failing that, population reads does the population bluff a lot in this river spot. So that's how we work it out in an end of action spot. We think about required equity and we ask ourselves those questions to see if we actually meet our required equity in the situation at hand. Try and avoid scatterbrained, psychic, soul-reading thought processes that are completely unjustified. Try and avoid listening to the guy at the casino who says that he can read souls and thinks he's Phil Hellmuth or whatever. Like, not that you'd want to be Phil Hellmuth anyway. But yeah, I rip Phil Hellmuth so often in this podcast. I think I need like a separate theme where I could just like rip Phil Hellmuth once every episode or something like that. Anyway, so this is a flavour of the book. That's the kind of thing to expect. There's plenty more hand examples, another 152 to be precise, and lots more analysis in the book as I teach the concepts. So stay tuned for that coming out on Amazon. It will be called The Grinder's Manual. Have a search for it. If you're listening to this in February, hopefully it will be there by then, but catch up with later podcasts to stay tuned for updates. You've got any questions about the book, about coaching? If you're looking for a coach, then admin at Carrot Corner. Send an email to me, Pete, and I'll get back to you, and check out carrotcorner.com in the meantime just for general poker stuff and all coaching related info. So hope you guys will be reading the book and love to hear your feedback when it does come out. And yeah, there'll be more Ask the Coach coming at you very soon on the Carrot Poker podcast. So until then, good luck at the tables and make some money.
Knocks me right out every time. But lately I've been slaking from